Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Avril Fiskin, and I'll be facilitating this evening's discussion about the Region of Waterloo's groundwater well interference complaints policy. Insights shared this evening will help the region develop an updated policy and process that is fair, transparent, and centered on residents' lived experiences. We very much look forward to taking time this evening to both share with you the current process and the plans, and also to address any questions that you may have and gather your feedback. Okay. So to kick us off, we'd like to acknowledge that the Region of Waterloo is situated on the lands within the Haldimand Tract of 1784, a formally ratified agreement acknowledging 6 miles on either side of the Grand River as treaty territory belonging to the 6 nations of the Grand River. These lands are also connected to the Between the Lakes Treaty 3 of 1792 between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the British Crown. The Region of Waterloo serves an area within the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Shawneton, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. This territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, which calls upon us to share the land and its resources fairly, represented by a shared dish and spoon, and to keep the dish clean by caring for the land and ensuring peace among all who share it. We acknowledge the enduring presence, knowledge, and philosophies of Indigenous people, and we acknowledge the continuing accomplishments and contributions Indigenous people make in shaping Waterloo Region. So we have a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we dive into our discussion today. In the event that one of our speakers experiences any technical difficulties, you may see them turn off their video. And for all attendees, except the speakers, mics have been turned off. And this is to minimize any background noise or interference noise that we may experience, like a dog barking. I have that all of the time. That said, we do want to hear your questions and feedback. So during the presentation and later during the question and answer period, you can use the Q&A window to share your thoughts. So if you're on a computer, just hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen for the toolbar to pop up. And then you can just click on the Q&A and type in your question. If you're on a smartphone or a tablet, you can just tap the bottom of your screen, and again, the toolbar will pop up. When you're using the Q&A function, you can choose to submit your questions anonymously or not. They'll either way will come through to us. Alternatively, if you prefer to ask your questions out loud, when we get to the question and answer period of today's call, you can simply use the raise your hand function and someone will unmute you. If during any part of this presentation or the Q&A, if you have any technical difficulties, just use the Q&A window to let us know, and a team member will reach out to you to help you troubleshoot. And I do just lastly want to note that the meeting is being recorded, and it's for the purposes of being shared on the region's Engage page. So before I introduce the agenda, I'd just like to provide a recap on why we're here. In response to the notion of motion proposed by Councillor Solonon on May 20th, Region staff were directed to restore an independent groundwater well interference appeal process. This resulted in an overall review of the complaint and appeal process, as well as the decision to host today's Public Information Center. The goal of this policy update is to strengthen public confidence in how complaints are assessed, decisions are made, and outcomes are determined. Tonight, we want to answer your questions and get your feedback so that the region can use your input to review and update the policy, helping to make sure it is fair and transparent. So in just a moment, I am going to introduce the folks who have joined us today, who will guide us through our discussion and answer your questions. But first, just in way of agenda, our presentation this evening is going to provide an overview of the groundwater well interference complaint policy as it stands today, as well as a review of the current process. Tonight, we'll also talk about some of the challenges experienced with the existing process and point to some of the areas that have been identified for improvement. We'll also take a look at how other municipalities have approached complaints. And finally, after the presentation, we'll open things up for conversation so we can hear from yourselves. So joining us on the call tonight from the Region of Waterloo are Leslie McKee, a senior hydrogeologist, Carl Belan, the acting manager, hydrogeology and water programs, Amy Shaw, who's the director of water and wastewater operations, and Dan Meager, who's the supervisor, water efficiency, innovation, and programs. And from AECOM, we have Matt Alexander, manager of hydrogeology, and Matt will be walking us through the bulk of today's session. We have Scott Cousins, hydrogeologist, and myself, who will be facilitating, Avril Fiskin, and Jessica Smith and Kira Watson, who are helping make all of this happen, and will be helping us troubleshoot should we have any issues. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Carl to say a few words on behalf of the region.
Yes, thank you, Avril. Hello, my name is Carl, as mentioned, and I am the interim manager of hydrogeology and water programs at the Region of Waterloo. I wanted to give a very brief overview of what our group does to support the science of groundwater in our region. The region has been managing a complex water system for decades now, including source water protection mapping through application of groundwater models, innovative water conservation, and planning. To provide stewardship of our groundwater system, the region has an extensive monitoring network and a long-term data sets that we use to identify trends and address issues that could threaten our groundwater sources. A component of this management is being good neighbors and addressing any possible well interference complaints that are raised by private well owners. We realize that our policy for addressing those is dated and hasn't fully evolved over time, or maybe it hasn't necessarily been communicated effectively. So we'd like to get your input to ensure that our process is sensible and is a fair one and is based on facts and data. Thanks.
Thank you. Before I hand things over to Matt, I just want to take a moment to remind everybody that the groundwater well interference complaint policy that we'll be discussing today applies to the entire region of Waterloo and is not limited to a single municipality. So when the updates are made, it will be a broad application. With that, I will pass it over to Matt to discuss the scope of the policy review, the elements of the current policy, and any opportunities for improvement. And after that, we'll open it up for questions. Thanks, Matt.
Much, Avril. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Okay, so I'll start by talking about what the review that we're undertaking is focused on. And there are 4 key aspects of the current policy that we're reviewing, including how complaints are assessed and investigated, how decisions are made, how they're reviewed and appealed, and how that's communicated, what outcomes and compensation are available, how the overall process can be improved to be more fair, transparent, and responsive. So I wanted to note that we understand that questions or concerns about groundwater on individual properties often requires more in-depth conversation. So to ensure that as many people as possible on the call today have a chance to have their voice heard, we would ask that you use the Water and Wastewater Services email that you see on the bottom of this slide in bold, if you have any of those types of questions. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to start today tonight, just talking specifically about what well interference is. So in the next slide, we have a simple graphic to understand what exactly it is we're talking about. And actually, there are multiple types of well interference. And the type that we're discussing today is often referred to as mutual interference. So simply put, this occurs when pumping one well causes the water level in another well to drop such that it cannot function normally. So looking at the graphic on the screen, there's a dashed blue line sort of near the top of the graphic. And this represents the original groundwater level in this scenario. So if we look at well number 2, this is represents a domestic well that is functioning as it should. And at the start of the scenario, the dashed line represents the water level above the black cylinder in the graphic, which is the pump. So with the water level above the pump, the well functions normally. When well number 1 beside it starts pumping, we see the water level dropping. So the arrows indicating the groundwater level becoming lower. And we see that it actually drops below the pump. So once that water level is below the pump, that well number 2 would not be able to function as it normally has. And well number 1 has caused interference with well number 2. So next slide, please. What can cause well interference? So groundwater pumping, just like I was talking about on the last slide there, pumping from nearby wells can affect surrounding wells. So this may include municipal water supply wells, because they do pump a lot of water, and other permitted or large-scale water users. So think about land uses that may use a lot of water. For example, industry may use water as part of the process. Agriculture may draw water to irrigate crops, for example. And so there are a number of possible water users that could cause this type of situation. But there are also other factors. It's not always caused by pumping. We have some listed here. So for example, the well condition. So the well itself that is experiencing an issue has to be maintained. And from time to time, you may have something like a broken pump that causes that well to not function as it was previously. Drought or seasonal changes. So every year, groundwater levels drop naturally when the season changes from the wet spring conditions to drier summer conditions. And if you have, for example, a drier than normal summer season, you can have groundwater levels that drop to the point that they affect a well from functioning normally. Increased water use. So in this case, we're talking about a well that is affected and is not operating as it previously did. This can be caused by the well itself being worked harder than it was previously. So if you think about normal well use for a residential home, you may pump something like 1,000 liters a day as an example, and maybe one day there's a pool to fill and you need 15,000 liters. That's stressing the well in a certain way that could cause it to function not as it normally does. And finally, another example we give here are physical changes to the aquifer. So this can get a bit technical, but we've seen examples where excavation for a construction project, for example, can depressurize an aquifer, which can cause water levels to drop in nearby wells, and this can also cause an impact. So there are a number of different scenarios that can affect a well from functioning normally. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the responsibilities that a permit to take water holder has. And I'll talk about what a permit to take water is in the next slide. So large water takings, including municipal wells, require a permit to take water from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation, and Parks. And so the threshold that the ministry has determined for when a permit to take water is required is 50,000 liters per day. So if you pump 50,000 liters or more in one day, you require a permit for that. Permits that are issued by the ministry contain conditions. And essentially, these are the rules that the water user must follow when they're working or pumping under that permit. So when well interference, an example of a condition that can be in a permit is that when well interference complaint is reported, the permit holder is required to investigate the issue. And if that pumping activity is found to cause well interference, the permit holder must take action to address it. And so the actions can include things like restoring a reliable water supply to the individual or the individuals that have been affected. So that water supply must be equivalent in quality and quantity. Providing an alternative source of water. So it may not be the same source that they had initially, but it has to be an alternative potable source of the same quality. The permit holder is required to compensate an affected well owner when it's determined that their pumping activity has caused interference. Another example of mitigation that may be taken is changing pumping activities to manage interference. So essentially, this would be pumping less so that there's more water available for everybody in the area. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a couple of slides here to talk about the history of complaints in the region. So that's well interference complaints and the current policy. Next slide, please. So the history of well complaints in the region goes back to the 1970s. And from the mid-1970s through the early 1990s, as the population grew and new groundwater wells were brought online, interference complaints were usually received every year. So we can see in the chart on the left, the gray bars represent the number of complaints received each year. And so we can see through that period of time from the 1970s to the early 1990s, it was fairly common for complaints to be received. We can see that the highest number of complaints occurred in about 1990. And then from the mid-90s to 2014, complaints were quite rare, where either no complaints were received or just a few complaints were received on an annual basis. Then between 2015 and 2025, there were no complaints received by the region. And so far in 2026, this is new data that's not shown on the chart, 17 well interference complaints have been received. In terms of the distribution of complaints, we can see on the pie chart on screen that of all the complaints shown in the graph on the left, 47% of those were received from within Wilmot Township, 30% from Kitchener, 16% in Cambridge, and then the remainder split between Wellesley, Waterloo, and Woolwich. Next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to spend a few slides discussing the evolution of the region's well interference policy, so how it's changed over time. There is a lot of content on these slides, but hopefully reviewing this history may spark some ideas for how the process could be improved moving forward, and that can be shared here tonight. Okay, so the first bullet, the first section, I should say, speaks to the pre-2001 period when well complaints were more common. And at that time, if a well owner was not satisfied with the decision that was made about well interference, they could appeal to the Regional Water Liaison Committee or the Well Interference Appeal Committee. So it went by different names over the years. And this committee awarded compensation to several complainants because of historical precedent. In 1995, the policy was modified as well as the procedures that go with it, to identify generalized areas around region wells that represented groundwater taking areas. So these areas were developed to determine how a well complaint is managed. And it's based on technical information such as environmental assessments, groundwater studies completed for the production wells, and the locations of previous compensation that have been documented since the region was incorporated in 1973. Then in 2001, the policy was updated again, and regional staff conducted a geographic analysis to establish the historic compensation areas. So this is another mapped area used to determine how a well complaint is managed. So both the groundwater taking areas and the historic compensation areas, I'll show a map in a few slides to give you an idea of what those look like. So the historic compensation areas were based on the outermost extent of properties that had received compensation in the past. And this first appeared in the 2001 policy update. In this policy, the location of a complaint was interpreted in favor of the complainant where any reasonable doubt exists. So what that means is when you consider the areas shown on the map that I'll show shortly, if a property was very close to the boundary or it was unclear whether it was inside or outside of the boundary, the situation was interpreted in favor of the well owner that had filed a well interference complaint. The 2001 update also included a one-time compensation payment of $4,000 for any well located within the historic compensation areas where a well complaint was lodged. Another aspect of this update was that the Well Interference Appeal Committee was composed of the regional chair, the chair of the engineering committee, the mayor of Wilmot Township, and 2 other regional councillors. Next slide, please. Okay, next in 2009, the policy was again updated. And one of the changes in 2009 was to include areas outside of the region near municipal boundaries that may be affected by regional pumping. So a good example of this is Puslinch on the east side of the region, where in Cambridge there are production wells located close to the boundary between the Region of Waterloo and Puslinch Township. And so the groundwater taking areas were extended outside of the region. In this update, the appeals continued to be handled by the Well Interference Appeals Committee, and they continued to include the historic compensation areas and groundwater taking areas. Finally, in 2015, the last update to the policy occurred, and this delegated the appeals of staff decisions on well interference complaints to the Commissioner of Transportation and Environmental Services. So with that update, the appeal process moved from a committee process to an individual making the decision on appeals. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the how the region currently responds to well interference complaints based on that policy updated in 2015. Okay, so I appreciate that there is a lot of information to receive, especially for those who are not familiar with the current policy. So what I'll do is I'll first go through an explanation of the information on these slides, and then we'll show a flow chart of the process in a few slides, just to give a visual of how the region moves through the process. So step 1, when an interference complaint is received, is the region looks to answer the question, where is the well located? And that's organized according to these 3 areas shown on this slide. Number 1 being groundwater taking policy areas. So I made reference to that in the timeline slide, and in the next slide I'll show a figure of where these actually are located. Number 2 is historic compensation areas. And then number 3 is areas outside of both. So basically, everything outside of those 2 areas. So within a groundwater taking policy area, these are the areas that are close to municipal wells. They're areas where the municipality is actively pumping groundwater, and complaints in these areas are investigated. Within historic compensation areas, these are places where people have been compensated in the past. And it doesn't always mean that there are problems there, but because of that historical precedent, the complaints in this area are investigated and compensation is awarded. And then areas outside of these are places where they're away from region wells, where data suggests a very low likelihood of well interference occurring. So stated another way, in these areas, the region's understanding of the aquifer data and of their own well system is that municipal pumping does not affect groundwater levels. And so because of this, complaints in these areas are not investigated by the region. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few times now, I've talked about these different areas. So this is a visual. Now, the region maintains a series of maps just like this one that cover the entire region. And so we've selected this map on screen as an example because it includes both groundwater taking areas and historic compensation areas. So the groundwater taking areas are shown by the dashed black lines. So they're circles or ovals that are generally drawn around the active municipal wells. And then the historic compensation areas are shown in blue, and they have more of a linear appearance. And that's because, as I mentioned, these are created by drawing lines around the properties where well owners have been compensated in the past. So they follow property lines. Next slide, please. Okay, so step 1 was determining where the well is located relative to those areas on the previous map. The next step for a well that's within a groundwater taking policy area or a historic compensation area is to provide emergency water to make sure that the resident has drinking water available. Additionally, the region sends an MECP licensed well contractor. So that's someone who's licensed by the Ministry of Environment to work with drinking water wells, and they conduct an inspection on the well. So there are a number of possible outcomes that come out of that inspection process. So if the well equipment and the well itself are working properly, but there's no water in the well, and it's within a historic compensation area, the region will investigate this further and offer compensation. If the well and equipment are working properly, but there's no water in the well, and it's within a groundwater taking policy area, the process moves to step 3, which is a detailed technical investigation. Finally, if the well and equipment are not working properly, and there's sufficient water in the well, this suggests that well maintenance is required. So the region advises the well owner to contact a well technician to repair the well or the pumping equipment. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so that covers off the groundwater taking policy areas and the historic compensation areas. Now there's also the third area, which is basically if your well is located outside of those areas. And in this case, the region advises the well owner to contact a well technician and provides a letter explaining why they are not taking further action. So in the next slide, it may be a bit difficult to see all the details, but I will walk through this. And it outlines the process, sort of a graphic of how the region moves through the process. So at the top, we see a well interference complaint. And there are, if we start on the left side of this figure, there are 3 options. So either you're outside of a historic compensation area and outside of a groundwater taking area. and then no action is taken. If you're inside a historic compensation area or inside a groundwater taking area, it moves down and a well technician visits the site. On the far right-hand side, we can see that it says previous complaint. And so what that means is there's a check in the records to determine if there's been a previous complaint, so the region can understand what may have been the issue with the well in the past. So after the well technician visits the site, the flow chart moves to two options. One is mechanical issues. So that's where it's determined that, for example, the well is not producing water because maybe a pump has been damaged or has burnt out and needs to be replaced. So that box goes towards no further action until mechanical issues are resolved. So the first step there is to fix the problem with the well or the associated equipment. On the right-hand side of the well technician site visit, we see no mechanical issues. So that's telling us everything's working fine, but the well is not producing water like it used to. So from there, it's either within the historic compensation area on the left, and if that's the case, the region issues a report with the technical details that have been collected, and they provide a letter that explains the remedy to the well owner. And this will include a one-time compensation of $4,000 that can be used towards fixing the issue. On the other side, after it's been determined that there's no mechanical issue and the well is located inside a groundwater policy area, the region will issue a report with the information that's been collected, and the report will either say that it's been confirmed that the region has caused interference and it outlines what's going to be done to fix the problem. Or on the far right-hand side, it will explain that the region has determined they don't believe that they have interfered with the well and that compensation will not be offered. So if we can move to the next slide, I wanted to talk a bit more about the technical investigation. So this is the detailed process for wells that are located within a groundwater taking policy area. And this process is completed by region staff. And what they look into is things like how much water is pumped from municipal wells in the area around the well where there's a problem, and has that pumping changed? How is the well, the private well, built, and how is the region well built? How close to each other are they? Are they pumping groundwater from the same aquifers, or are they obtaining water from different aquifers? Are there monitoring wells in the area? So these are groundwater monitoring wells that are owned by the region and part of the network that Carl mentioned earlier. And they provide data on an ongoing basis for that area. So the region has the ability to look at that data and understand how have groundwater levels been changing over time. Have they been going up, down, or not changing much? Another question and aspect of the investigation is, are there any other region activities in the area that could cause an impact? So I mentioned earlier examples of how a construction project, for example, could cause an impact to a well. And so we need to understand, is there something like that happening that could be causing a problem? Next slide, please. So there's also other sources of information that can be used, like previous studies that have been done when a new well was drilled, when an environmental assessment was completed for a well, or when a study was done to support a permit application to the Ministry of Environment. So those available reports are reviewed to understand, what do we know about the geology in the area? What do we know about the hydrogeology or the groundwater levels in the area? Monitoring data, so I mentioned that a bit on the last slide, and I will talk about it to describe a map on the next slide. And so, of course, monitoring data is reviewed extensively to understand what's known about the conditions. And again, we're looking to answer questions like, did the problem start when a new well began pumping? Because that's a high-risk activity where there's going to be definite changes around the new well. So is it a new well, or did an existing well start to pump more water? And all of these questions help figure out if the municipal well caused the issue. So I made reference to the next slide, which is a map, and it does have a lot of information, but I'll highlight some very specific things here. So there's a black box sort of in the middle of this figure, and that's outlining an area of municipal wells, regional wells, located in Wilmot Township. So they're called K50, 51, and 52. And you can see a number of labels around that well. And those represent monitoring locations that the region collects data on an ongoing basis. So the circles that are shown in green and orange represent groundwater monitoring wells that collect groundwater level data on an ongoing basis. And there are also blue diamonds, and these are locations where streams and wetlands are monitored. So those locations also monitor water levels, but they're in the shallow part of the system. So surface water and shallow groundwater. So this shows the distribution and extent of monitoring data in the Wilmot area, and data is collected at these locations on an ongoing basis and provides a record of groundwater level change over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so possible mitigation measures. So after an investigation has been completed and it's been determined that a well has been impacted, what can be done? So first is installation of temporary water supply. So this is usually a shorter term solution, while a more permanent solution is being developed. So I mentioned one of the first steps of the process is to provide emergency water. So this is short-term drinking water immediately. This bullet here, talking about temporary water, is more of a sort of medium to longer term solution. So essentially what this looks like is a water tank being brought to the property and being filled with potable water and connected to the interior plumbing of the house, so that tank can supply water to the home and then be refilled as needed as water is used. So that's one option. Again, that's usually done while a more permanent option is being considered. And a more permanent option may be connection of the home where there's been a well issue to the municipal water system. So in some cases, there may be a water main nearby that could deliver water to the home if a connection is made. Another option may be to drill a replacement well for the well that's been affected, and then abandon the old well. And finally, pumping reduction. So this is another option. For example, if it's a new well that's just started pumping, perhaps it's pumping at a rate that's too high, and reducing that pumping rate could cause groundwater levels to increase, and the well that's been affected may be able to operate like it used to. I also want to talk about compensation, so the monetary aspect of a solution. And there's a couple of different scenarios. So within the historic compensation areas, the way that a monetary payment is made is it's a fixed amount. So it's a $4,000 payment if you're within the historic compensation area, and this is automatically approved. So the detailed investigation that I mentioned under step 3 is not necessarily required within that area. For the groundwater taking policy areas, the payment of a solution corresponds to the actual total amount incurred for the solution. And I put in brackets there the acceptable amount, and this refers to the fact that the invoices submitted when, for example, a new well is drilled are reviewed by the region as part of the process. Okay, so finally, under the current policy, I want to talk about the appeals process. So I didn't point this out on the flow chart, but it was at the very bottom underneath the final step. So after a letter is issued to a well owner, there is the option to appeal. So if the owner who receives that letter is in disagreement with that decision, it can be appealed to the Commissioner of Transportation and Environmental Services. So when that is requested, there'll be a hearing, and that's completed, and a record of that meeting is issued to the well owner. Through the appeals process, the region has the option to initiate an additional technical investigation from a third party. So this is someone who doesn't work directly for the region. Usually it's a consultant. And the consultant would go through the process of investigating the complaint and all of the information available, make their own assessment of what may be happening with the groundwater system, and issue their findings to the commissioner for consideration under this appeals process. So once the commissioner has all of this information, they consider it and issue a letter to the well owner outlining the decision. And so the decision may be to support the initial staff decision, or to award compensation, or to award additional compensation. Next slide, please. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the explanation of the current policy that I prepared tonight. And next, we'll talk about some current challenges. Next slide, please. So over the last number of months, the region's received a lot of feedback about the current policy and where it maybe could be improved. And so in this table, we've tried to capture some of the key themes that the region has heard. And we're using this information to direct the policy update. So I'll go through these key themes here tonight, and hopefully this will spark some discussion from the group. So on the left, we have sort of the key components of the current policy. And on the right, we have some ideas for what maybe could change. So under investigation and assessment, some ideas are improving consistency and clarity in how complaints are assessed. The next one is strengthening how evidence is used and communicated. Under governance, decision-making, and appeals, some ideas are, could there be a more independent appeal process? So we talked, when I went through the timeline of how things have changed in the region with the policy through the years, for a long period of time, there was a committee that listened to appeals and made a decision, and now it's an individual. So potentially it could be more independent and go to a committee model. The next bullet is clarifying roles in decision-making and review. Under outcomes and compensation, we're reviewing the compensation approaches and potentially expanding the range of outcomes and remedies. Okay, so under framework and policy areas, we're assessing whether the existing policy area boundaries, so if you think about the map that I shared that showed the historic compensation areas and the groundwater taking areas, we're looking to answer the question, should these existing boundaries be revised, be replaced, or potentially removed? Is there an option to move towards a more flexible and consistent approach to evaluating complaints, including reduced reliance on predefined geographic boundaries? And finally, accessibility and communication. So one thing we've heard through this process is there are a lot of people living in the region of Waterloo that weren't aware of the well interference policy. They weren't necessarily aware of what to do if there was an issue with their well that wasn't, caused by their use of the well. So how can the region improve access and communication regarding the policy and the process that they follow? Slide, please. Okay, how other municipalities approach complaints. So part of what AECOM, our company, is doing to support the region through this process is to review what's done elsewhere. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see a number of jurisdictions listed here. And so this is a subsection of existing examples. And what we're doing is we're reviewing how these jurisdictions approach well interference complaints and how they move through the full process from receiving a complaint to the appeals process. So we're looking at the city of Guelph, which is a great example. It's very close to the region of Waterloo. There are shared aquifers between Guelph and Waterloo, particularly in Cambridge. We're looking at York region, Peel region, and Durham. We're also looking outside of the province. For example, there's a good example from Nova Scotia called the Sydney Wellfield. And we're looking at US jurisdictions, for example, Oregon, Michigan, Minnesota. And we have included a couple of examples on the next slide that we're reviewing, and included some key bullets from how these two jurisdictions manage well interference complaints. And hopefully this gives the group some ideas of what may be good ideas for the update to the region's policy. So for example, in Guelph, they have a standard operating procedure that ensures a structured, transparent investigation process that is supported by technical expertise and comprehensive data collection. So much like the region of Waterloo, the city of Guelph has in-house or staff working for the city that are technical experts, hydrogeologists. So they have that available to them, but they also have the ability through their process to bring in external expertise. Their policy incorporates an appeal mechanism through a well interference committee, and this consists of elected officials across jurisdictions. So in Guelph, the relevant jurisdictions are Puss Lynch Township, Guelph, Iramosa, and the town of Milton. So depending on where the well with an issue is located, those different jurisdictions will be involved in the committee. And through the Guelph process, there's no monetary limitation that's placed on remedial actions. So another example that we're reviewing is in Sydney, Nova Scotia. It's a little bit different than Guelph and the region because rather than it applying to the whole city or the whole region with dozens of wells, it applies to just one well field. So it was a new well field that was being brought online. There were citizens in the area that were concerned because they had private wells, their own wells that they've been using for a long period of time. And there was concern that the new well field in Sydney would affect their use of their wells. And so a community liaison committee was formed. And this group actually helped the municipality develop policy. And this policy was signed by the citizens group, by the provincial regulatory authority, and by the municipality. It includes a contingency plan and a community oversight mechanism, meaning that concerned community was involved through the process when there was an issue. Their policy defines criteria for what constitutes a groundwater impact, including thresholds for the loss of quantity and quality degradation. So it's very specific in terms of what does an impact look like. It also includes a structured dispute resolution process that serves as its appeal mechanism. So somewhat similar to Guelph, it has a committee approach. And in this case, the way that it's structured is when a resident brings forward a well complaint, they select a representative to be on the appeal committee. The municipality selects a representative, and then those two representatives select a neutral third party. And between the three, the individuals decide the outcome of an appeal. Next slide, please. Okay, so that brings us to next steps. And so we're going to continue through the process of reviewing the example policies in those various jurisdictions. We're going to consider the feedback from engagement that the region has been undertaking. and finalize our review. And that will include recommendations for how the policy can be updated. An agenda package will be released in early August, and that agenda will be for the council meeting, which is in August on the 12th. And that agenda package will include the updated materials. And then on the 12th, the council will meet to review and discuss the revised policy.
Thank you, Matt. With that, we are going to move into the Q&A portion of our call. So as a reminder, you can either ask your questions using the Q&A function found in the toolbar in the bottom of the screen, or you can use the raise your hand option. We also, and you can see it on the screen now, we have a link and a QR code for a survey that we would invite everybody in attendance to complete before June 30th. It has a few more questions around the complaint and appeal process that we'd really love to get your feedback on. We do have a few questions that are queued up, and before I go to them, I am going to ask, Kira, do you mind launching one of the poll questions? I think the first one, just to give people a sense of the survey questions that we would be looking for more input on later. And it also gives us some live feedback, which we would love. So the first poll question is, how well do you understand how to report a well complaint with the region? And then you have three options, and you can just click on them. Very well, somewhat, not at all. And then a follow-up to that question is, do you have a preference for how you would like to be able to report a complaint? And there's two options there. The first is a phone line to call in a complaint, and the second is an online form to complete. So if you can just take a moment, respond to those polls, we will give you a live view to what we see. And Kara, you can just let us know when you've got a few responses.
I'll give it a few more seconds and then I'll close it.
Thank you.
Okay, closing the poll now.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a couple of responses. So we've got there were 10 responses overall to the first question, and 1 out of those 10 very clearly understood how to report a well complaint. 8 of the 10 had rated somewhat, and 1 had rated not at all. So great information for the review team and also the Region of Waterloo. I think one of the options that was raised was the whole how do we communicate about the well complaint process? And this is a good indication that there may be some opportunities there. So the second one is, do you have a preference for how you would like to be able to report a complaint? We have 5 of 9 suggesting a phone line, and almost the same amount suggesting an online form to complete. Okay, thank you. I am going to go, I'm looking at the participants. There's no hands raised at the moment, but we do have a few questions in the Q&A. So I'll go to one, and that is currently the region's investigation does not always include getting information like static water level. Provided this is necessary information for both the region and the resident to have in order to accept compensation, and to sign away their rights for future claims, what specific data will be deemed necessary for a truly fulsome investigation to prove or disprove liability? And that might be a region question to respond to initially, with potentially some input from Matt with respect to the future policy. So Carl, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a crack at it. So at this point, we are just kind of collecting information about what to include in an updated policy. We don't have an updated policy at this point. So I do think that collection of any information available from a well owner, like whatever information you have about your well, you would know it better than the region would. And so that would be part of our initial investigation. What work has been done at your well, what you know about the details, the depths, the diameter, the condition, any work that has been done, we would collect that information. That's part of our initial investigation. But the primary focus of our initial assessment would be to ensure that whatever well owner is there has access to water. That's our number one concern. And where it's not available, it warrants further investigation.
Okay. Thanks, Carl. Anything to add from anybody?
Yeah, Avril, I'll speak to sort of, forward looking with the new policy. And I think one thing that maybe the question is getting at is you don't always have the same type of data in every scenario. One of the challenges with groundwater science is that everywhere you look under the ground, there is water somewhere, but we don't have information for every square inch of a given area in terms of what's happening underground. So you're always looking at points of data, and you certainly could have a scenario where there is a well with an issue and there's no monitoring well, for example, nearby. So that's something that the policy has to address. What do you do when there's uncertainty? What do you do when there's maybe insufficient data to make a decision in any which direction? So, you cannot foresee every situation associated with every well complaint. So you do need a flexible policy that addresses what do you do with unknowns and uncertainty. So that's something we'll be looking to address.
Thank you. I've got another question. So, and Matt, you may have touched on this with respect to surface water. So this is a related question. Can we submit a well interference complaint for impacts to surface water bodies like streams and ponds, etc.?
So my understanding of the current policy is it's only for drinking water well complaints. Have I got that right, Carl?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So this policy does not cover that scenario.
Okay. Thank you. Another question is, and this might be a comment, but the process for developing a well interference committee should include community members who have had experience with well interference to ensure that the process is comprehensive. Any, Matt, any insights from some of the studies that you may have reviewed at this point?
Yeah, it's a good comment. So certainly, like obviously the individual with the well issue would be involved, but I think the comment specifically stated an individual with experience being on the committee. So I guess from the ones we've looked at, I mentioned the example in Nova Scotia. That would probably be the most alike that suggestion, where the individual who has an issue and files a complaint can select their representative. So whether it's an expert to sort of state the case on their behalf, or it could be in this to align with that suggestion. It could be someone who's been through the process and has some experience from that perspective. So there would be some flexibility in that example.
Okay. Thank you. We do have a couple of hand raised, so I'll jump to the hands that are currently up. Kira, could you unmute Mark, please? Hi, Mark.
Good evening. How are you?
Good.
So my name is Mark Reeser. I am Vice President of the Waterloo Federation of Agriculture. I'm a farmer and I'm within the catchment area of the Mannheim Wells. So I have a question about something that was mentioned at least twice, I think maybe 3 times, and that was long-term trends and data sets from the monitoring wells and from the wells themselves. How does one access that information?
Carl, is that a question for yourself?
Yeah, I suppose that data really isn't publicly available in its kind of data stream sense. There are some published reports out there that would have interpreted raw data, and that interpretation would have been done by professionals, and that's our preferred method of disseminating information like that is in the form of reports where it's been analyzed.
Well, thank you, but I'm going to suggest that that information should absolutely be public so that the public can actually see what the data says rather than it being interpreted. And so I would make that suggestion that that data should be released immediately, if possible, to anyone who wishes to see it. I think that's really important that we be transparent in this entire process instead of keeping things perhaps behind the scenes, not a proper way to do things.
If you wouldn't mind if I just jump in. We do provide the reports if asked, and I have provided the latest SLR report to the Citizens for Safe Groundwater back earlier this year. So we do have the new biennial reports, which we're expecting to see by the end of this week. And those go to the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. And we've also committed to individuals that once we have those reports as well, that yes, they're not publicly available. We don't put them on our website just due to the size, but absolutely, if you would like to see a copy of those, just reach out and we can provide a copy.
Okay, thank you, Amy. And it is to you that we make that request?
That's fine. It can come through myself, yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Mark. We have another question. Kira, can you please unmute Samantha?
Hi, thank you. Right on. Yeah, so 2 sort of follow-ups. I'll just in response to, thank you, Amy Shaw. Yes, I had requested the 15-minute raw transducer data to look at the pumping since 2019. But what I received was the biannual report that had just become available. But that is not the data. I don't think that Mark Reeser was referring to requesting. That just shows sort of averages and trends over time, which is definitely interesting, but not the data that really needs to be publicly available. And then just another comment. I think it was a resident who asked about surface water. I have a question just in response to that. I understand that there's a spring-fed pond in Shingletown that the region still continues to pump 6 liters of water a second to, because they recognize that their pumping was dropping that pond, which then impacted Huntsberger Creek. I do understand there were other wetlands that some water went to, but I think it was in 2019 that one of those wells, I was told, didn't receive water anymore at that point in time. So I'm just curious, what process does the region have available to look at impacts to surface water from municipal pumping? Like what process led to these wetlands being given that attention from the region?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I mean, there is ongoing pumping to a residence nearby to the K50's wells as a mitigative measure to supply base flow to a creek nearby. Um, that was established a long time ago, and I don't know all the details of how it was established. It was long before my time at the region, but we have agreed with that landowner to continue supplying that creek through a mitigative measure. Yeah, and we do have monitoring at nearby streams and creeks to ensure that they aren't impacted.
So, okay. Yeah, I'm still curious about how we can ensure that because there's a lot of reports of dropping water levels in spring-fed ponds, creeks, marshes, completely dried up, multiple marshes, and obviously you guys are aware of the wetland that has disappeared. So
I can help with that one a little bit, Samantha. So just going back to the creek, it was a concern with respect to the amount of water that was in the creek for the overall health of the creek. So I believe that was part of the decision back around the permit to take water issuance, that was part of the mitigating measures for that. As for the bodies of water, the surface water, I do believe you might be aware that we were reached out to about putting a monitoring well in that the one specific surface water body, and it is private property. So I do know that Jeff, before he went off, he had reached out and said that we would be interested in putting a monitoring well in that location. Obviously, we've got some, hurdles to jump through with respect to, land access agreements and those types of things. So it's not that we're not interested. There's just a few hurdles, and obviously we can't monitor every single surface water body that's out there. I think from the council presentation that we had Jeff do, he did say it's very difficult to make a correlation between climate effects for surface water versus a well is much easier with the well levels. It's a little bit easier to make a coordination between the two versus surface water bodies, which are much more susceptible to changes due to weather, rain, climate effects. So
excellent. No, thank you for that.
Thanks, Samantha. I am just going to move on to another.
Yeah, okay.
I don't want to limit you, but I do
Yeah,
have a few
no,
things.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have Pauline has a question. Do you have data available for the public regarding the test well at the intersection of Mannheim and Huron Road? Not sure if this relates to the existing study of the policy or historical.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a very specific question. So there is a monitoring well there, and that's the kind of thing maybe we can reach out specifically one-on-one to provide a follow-up on that.
Okay. Kira, Jessica, when Pauline had registered, would we have a contact information? If not, Pauline, if you want to put your email into the Q&A, we'll have it available. Thank you. Kira, can you please unmute Martha?
Hi, just a question. With this well interference committee, the independent well interference committee that's going to happen, if this committee investigates a dry well and rules that the region's pumping caused it, is that decision legally binding? Or can the committee legally force the region to turn down the pumps and pay for a new well immediately? Or is this just an advisory group?
I don't know if
Perhaps
I can answer that. Sorry, I don't, yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if I can answer that right now, Martha, just because any policy that we do come up with would obviously have terms and conditions with it. And we'd probably have to see like I would like to see a process where the committee's decision stands. Like I can and based on evidence and based on, you know, the technical data. So I would like to not get in a process where we would be challenging the committee's decision. Because the whole point of the committee would be to reach a conclusion based on evidence and facts, right? So we would have to, any policy we do come up with, though, I would assume legal would review it, and I'm assuming the area municipalities' legal teams would also review it and provide comments before it's finalized.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll go back to the Q&A, and then we'll come back to the raised hands. We do have a question. What will the policy be for wells used for geothermal heating and cooling along with drinking water supply wells? So are they in scope of the policy?
I don't think we've made those decisions. I think that's the point of gathering input, is to decide what should be in scope and what shouldn't be in and out of scope, right? Obviously, our main priority is drinking water supply wells, but again, I'm not going to rule any input into a process out.
Okay, thank you. We have Kira, can you please unmute Hugh?
Good evening, Avril.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to follow up on Matt's comment about the process. Not so much the operation of the committee, but I was suggesting that there actually be community representatives on the committee that creates the policy, so that it's comprehensive in the sense that it actually looks at it and includes things from their perspective. That would be really helpful, as opposed to a strictly technical one. And we've encouraged this. We've also encourage you to look at the old policy, the pre-1991, before the region employed staff, hydrogeological staff, and look at that process, because it was a very welcoming committee compared to the current process, which can sometimes seem a little bit cold and unfriendly to well owners, as well as invisible to many as well. Most of the people that are experiencing well interference out in Wilmot Center didn't know that there was a process. So that was my comment.
Hugh, could I just ask you a question on that? So it's Amy. We're really tight for timelines on this, because I think, as we noted, August 4th it'll be posted, which means I think we have to get the council report to our people to sign off at like mid-July. So as you can see, the timelines are really, really tight based on the timelines we've been given. Would you want to meet with staff, or do you have other individuals that you would, or would you want to submit that information via email, or how would you see that being done, just under the tight timelines that we've got here?
Well, how are you developing I guess the question would be, how are you developing, what process are you using for developing the recommendations for council?
Maybe I'll defer to ACOM, just how they're going about making recommendations.
Sure. Yep. So our process is to do the literature review that I referenced in the presentation, to look at obviously the current policy and the the information that the region provides, and then we'll also be preparing a report that summarizes the feedback that we've received. So Avril talked about some of the engagement that we've done, and the remaining engagement in terms of the survey and these types of things. So we'll compile all of that into a report, and that will be part of the information that's considered during the process. And so ultimately, our report will include recommendations from ACOM, from all of that information that we're recommending the region considers in the policy update. And yeah.
Yeah, I think you would benefit because there's a cultural dimension to this as well as a technical. And looking at other jurisdictions is always useful. But there's a history in the Waterloo region going back to the 1960s that I think would be a mistake to overlook. Because say the Wilmot Center and Wilmot Township as a whole has a culture has a history with this concern, and I think involving people who have been actually lived the process and worked through the process with the original committee, I think could be invaluable to developing one now that's comprehensive. I think we made that recommendation, Samantha, didn't we, at that meeting we had with staff and ACOM a couple of weeks ago?
Yep, we heard that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
so
really
I reinforce that. I think it's really important. You know, I know looking at other places is usually standard, but you have to also look at the history of what we have here for a truly community engaged process. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. I'm just looking, there's a couple of questions related to the committee that I'll just, while we're on this topic. So will this committee have the power to look at the cumulative impact of both municipal and other local well taking operations together? And again, I know the policy is still in development, so, but any initial thoughts?
So I think I would interpret that to mean, would the region consider determining if a third party has caused interference?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, my initial thought on that is that may be more of a MECP issue, to investigate a potential impact not related to the region's activity. So certainly, I know the question was, would the region investigate both? Of course, the region would be focusing on their activities. And if there's an additional water taker that may have caused an impact, I think that would fall to MECP to investigate.
I will just add, Matt, though, that we do provide comments to the ministry on those types of permit to take water applications. So our staff and Carl, like our staff, do evaluate those and provide comments to the ministry. Another note is we have met with the ministry recently, just with respect to all that's going on. And they have committed to looking at more of a cumulative impact on the aquifers moving forward versus more of a localized review when they're doing their permit to take water application reviews. So knowing the water capacity issue that's happening here at the region, they are much more aware of that now. And so they did say they're going to be expanding that to more of a cumulative approach. So it's good news.
Okay. And one additional question regarding the committee. So will the committee have access to live data, or as soon as, sorry, my screen jiggled. Will the committee have access to live data, or as soon as data is collected or coming back from the lab?
So that I heard the end of that was about a lab. So that I think that's referencing water quality. Yes. Maybe
it doesn't specify, but
yeah. Okay. So I guess it's just in terms of the data that would be available to a committee. Again, we're kind of speculating because it hasn't been decided yet. But so typically at the committee level, all of the data would have been reviewed prior to a case being reviewed by the committee, and so they would have access to all of the same information that was reviewed through the process, including if there is say, for example, a third-party consultant involved. Anything considered in their process would be documented in a report, and the committee would have access to all of that. And often they also have access to the authors of that information, so they can ask them questions about what was reviewed and what they looked at. So I'm not, that doesn't answer the question about the lab, but I didn't quite follow that.
Yeah. If there's a follow-up question, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A. And then Matt, while you've got the mic, we have a question with respect to AECOM's involvement. So to what degree is AECOM involved in the evaluation of groundwater interference complaints? Is AECOM just involved as a consultant in the policy update?
So AECOM has also been retained to review some well interference complaints for the region. So we've done some work on both sides of that question.
Okay. And then we do still have two hands raised. Samantha and Mark, are these hangovers from hands raised before? Mark, I'll unmute you first just to see, and feel free to say you've already had your question answered.
No, thank you. I have some further questions, if I might.
Yep.
First of all, I would echo Hugh's concern about culture, and certainly agree with what he said, and would add to that we have a history of meeting in person instead of online. Realize that's a little bit too late for tonight, but certainly in the future, meeting where you can actually see and engage with people is incredibly important out here in the countryside, and it's something that we do, and we always do it that way. I'd also like to perhaps pursue again, because I'm not quite sure I know the answer here, with regard to long-term trends and data sets. I'm not really interested in a report. I'm actually interested in data. And again, I would ask the question, how does one access that data? Which I think most certainly should be public. The size of the file doesn't really matter. We're quite capable of dealing with that. And then finally, if the mandate here of the committee is to recommend a better process to address complaints, I'm wondering if we shouldn't really deal with the elephant in the room, and that is the pumping of increasing amounts of water from Wilmot, because that is the elephant in the room. And I think it is concerning when I hear someone say we can continue to pump water without any adverse effects. When one is pumping 4.6 million liters a day out of the township, every drop of that water is water that would have otherwise left or exited the aquifer in a spring or a seep and contributed to base flow in streams and wetlands and so on. I think we're bypassing the issue here, and that is, how do we address the issue of reducing pumping? And I think we really need to, and the council needs to hear this again, that we really need to look at conservation, and we need to look at limits on growth, because those are the only ways where we can reduce pumping. And pumping in this township is having negative effects. It has since it first began when the Mannheim wells were built back in the 70s, and it doesn't get any better, it gets worse. And I think that's tragic, and let's deal with the issue and put it back before council.
Thanks for your comments, Mark. Appreciated.
Mark, just to go back to the data piece, there is a possibility of doing a data sharing agreement. So maybe if you don't mind reaching out to me after this is over, we can have that discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Samantha, is your hand still up from before, or do you have a new question? Kara, if you can unmute Samantha.
Yeah, I don't have a specific question, but I think I just really would echo what Mark was saying, that I do have a ton of specific questions, but the real concern here is that we are looking at, I know the region is reporting 17 official well interference reports. Our citizen group has 34 reports of well interference, as well as the surface water concerns that we're seeing. And that is sort of the big picture there and the fact that the region is increasing pumping. And as CSGW has shared in council chambers, we really do think that this requires a third party review, fulsome, to look at what this continued drawdown has done to the area and what is in the bank water wise, and the interconnectivity, and not just looking at things case by case, but looking at the big picture. And then that obviously would allow the region to plan their future with a much more proactive, educated outlook on Wilmot and what's available. Because right now the residents are feeling like we are taking all of the burden of risk, while the region is we're taking there are residents that are showering at the rec center. There are residents that are canceling family get-togethers, lugging jugs of water. So grateful for the emergency water. The well interference committee is a great step in the right direction, but definitely need to look at the big picture. So whatever staff can do to bring that forward would be appreciated by the community.
Thanks, Samantha. Amy or Carl, any comments before I go to another question?
No, I was just going to say I know that that sentiment is there, and I know we've got multiple council directives on this, and so I appreciate that is a concern. I really want to not get off that topic, but the goal for us is to really put in place a policy that works for the community in the interim, as we know that this is not really working for anyone. So yeah, but I appreciate Samantha's comments.
Thank you. Another question, and this is probably in reference to the current policy. If I take the $4,000 to fix my pump today, am I legally banned from getting help if the region's pumps, big pumps, dry my well in the next year's well out completely next year?
I'm going to defer to Carl or Leslie on that.
Yeah.
Sure. No. If you're talking about an ongoing complaint, we would review any current complaint. We've received a motion from council that we are to review any current complaint under the updated policy. So after the policy has changed and is in place, any complaints received this year could be in the Wilmot Center area, could be reviewed under that updated policy.
Okay. And it looks, Kira, Hugh has a question. If you could unmute Hugh.
Yes, thank you again, Avril. Something that when we spoke to your colleagues and region staff recently, Samantha and I raised the issue of how to deal with these things. And I know this is not sort of a reactive part, but more the proactive. How do we include in this policy and the process a way of avoiding these from happening again by looking at the well fields where you're going to do increased pumping and identifying potential wells that might be impacted based on the information that's available? To me, this seems like a logical thing to do, is to move to the next level, not just reacting to problems, but actually anticipating and dealing with them proactively, so that people don't have to go through, in case some of these people, 6 years or more of having to, basically deal without a water supply. So that's my question.
Sorry, Amy.
Yeah, you're muted.
You're unmuted. Sorry about that. I was going to say the water supply strategy update, Hugh, is really where that detailed analysis should occur. I think the issue is the last one was completed in 2015, and work began on this one in 2022. So it will be that analysis is exactly what we want to do to make sure that we aren't over pumping, that we do have enough water to supply the residents and the anticipated growth to 2051. So that is underway right now. We are not at a stage where we've evaluated all of that, but Hugh, I would say that is exactly where that level of investigation and detail would take place.
It may not even be over pumping though, Amy. It could just be pumping in general because any taking of water will affect the water, will affect the aquifer system. So it's just being mindful of that is I think is what the Citizens for Safe Groundwater are looking for is a more forward-looking policy.
And where new supplies can go, where it's safe to go, that all of that is factored in. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
We do have a question, and this relates to measuring water, and it looks like with respect to static water levels. So why doesn't the region send someone to measure how much water, static water level, are in wells now? So a question around, do people need to know their baseline water level before any legal paperwork is signed?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. It's a bit of a tricky one. I think, we have a current policy, and the policy areas, the way it's laid out right now, kind of identify what path we take in our current policy. It's difficult to say what would be done at any particular location because a different avenue would be taken under the current policy. Yeah, in a new policy, like you may want to make that comment that this should be a fundamental thing that's done in a follow-up policy, and we can take that and evaluate that.
Matt, is there any comment with respect to some of the policies that you've been and team have been reviewing, or?
So the way I interpret this question is, sorry, I'm just reading it on screen. So how much water is in my well right now? So baseline data. Yeah. So I think one challenge with baseline data specific to each and every private well in the region is simply the size of the region. So we gave the example, or I did when I was speaking through the slides of the example in Nova Scotia, and that related to a specific well field, and even to the extent that it listed, the properties or the roads that were sort of covered by the policy. And so it was, I would say, like a number of wells where it was feasible to go out and collect baseline data from each and every well. I haven't looked at the specific number, but I would expect that there's probably hundreds to thousands of private wells within Waterloo region. So it makes it that much more challenging to have baseline data at every location. And then there's, cost implications and all of that. So what we see in other similar municipalities that have, that are large and have a lot of groundwater supply wells is they rely on a network of monitoring locations as opposed to trying to monitor every well. And so essentially what you're doing is designing a network that is, geographically distributed throughout your jurisdiction and also vertically distributed. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're collecting data from vertically from all the important levels within the geologic layering, and that way you can cover the area both sort of at the ground surface level, covering the full area, and then vertically covering the full area. And that tends to be the approach rather than trying to, approach private well owners and get access agreements and that sort of thing, just because it's a very big task.
Thank you. We do have a couple of new hands raised. Kira, can you please unmute Peter?
Hi there. My name is Peter Bingaman. I have Country Gardens RV Park here. I think that that data that is out there in those monitoring wells would be really important to me to compare to my existing well to see if I'm for a risk assessment, because I'm dealing with a lot of people here in the summertime, and I'm requiring on the low side 20,000 liters per day up to 45,000 liters per day to service my customers here. And also, I like to be able to try and foresee if I'm going to have a problem instead of reacting to a problem. So that data would be very, very important to me.
I am going to take that back and see what quantity of data we're talking about, how it could be packaged, how it could be distributed, whether it could be done by a link to a SharePoint. So I will take that back, Peter, and see what the possibilities are and get back to everyone.
Thanks, Amy. Laverne has raised her hand.
Yes.
Can someone unmute Laverne?
I think Laverne, if you're having difficulties, I think there could have been a pop-up that came up that you would just click to unmute. If not, Kira, can you confirm that you have? There she is.
Yes, my question is, the wells in my area are at various depths. I paid for my well to be done, and in the 90-foot region, and I have very good water. If that well were to go dry, and the region said that was their fault and would drill a new well, and they say when it had to go to 250 feet, where you would hit hard water minerals, which some of my neighbors have and have to have expensive equipment on. You now have poor water quality. So I'm just wondering how the region would handle that. The other question is, this Zoom meeting shows us the region is really not interested in meeting with us as residents on a one-on-one. This makes me think you're not really interested in transparency. What is the long-term view as to how you're going to find water without drawing from the aquifer in the long term? Is a pipeline, I've heard from Lake Erie, is that something that you're still considering? Thank you.
I can take two of those and then I'll pass it to Carl about the depth of the well. So Laverne, we always want to do in-person meetings, and that's typically been what we've historically always done, and that's always our preference. The timing on this, unfortunately, we had to have 3 different separate meetings on this with respect to the input, and we did have really tight timelines. With that said, if you are interested in meeting with staff to discuss something, we're more than happy to set that up. We did have to get this survey out to be able to do that in time to get the feedback in. So I do appreciate that it looks like it's a lack of transparency, but I can assure you this is not the way we prefer to do in-person meetings. And so staff have met with many of the individuals on this call in person. And so, yes, I would say that this is not the ideal, but we do have a tight timeline to work with, unfortunately. With respect to the pipeline question, as I mentioned, the long-term water supply strategy is looking at all options, and some of those may include a pipeline to Lake Erie, depending on the needs of the growth in the area of the region up until 2051. So we will be going to council in the fall, late 2026, with a short list of options for them to consider. That work is underway right now. So there's no actual recommendation on the table, but all options are on the table, including a surface water source. So hope that helps. And then Carl, if you don't mind answering the question about the well depth.
Yeah, sure. So it's a great point, Laverne, that if we were to impact a well and drill a deeper well, there could be a change in water quality. And if that was a worsening in water quality, then there are treatment methods that could be put in place that maybe you wouldn't have needed in one aquifer, but would be needed in another aquifer. And whoever has caused the interference would bear some responsibility in providing a similar water quality to what was available before. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Laverne. Mark? Kira, if you can unmute Mark, please.
Thank you. I would like to go back to culture if I could, and perhaps frame it in a different way. And I call it rural culture or rural lived experience. We don't live in the city. When we turn on the tap, we depend on our well. Urban people have the luxury of turning on the tap and water always comes out. There's a significant level of anxiety involved in having a well, especially in an area where water may not come out at some point because of a lowered aquifer. That is something that's difficult to compensate for. You can pay for a new well. You can pay for water treatment. But the level of compensation that is offered at $4,000, I think is grossly low. And I'll speak from experience as a farmer who not only depends on water for my household, but also water for my livestock. And if that supply is interrupted for some reason, it's a life or death situation with livestock. And the anxiety involved in not knowing whether your water supply is going to be there or not. It's difficult to put a value on it, but I would simply suggest this. The level offered of $4,000 should probably be somewhere around $20,000, $25,000. May seem like a lot, but that would certainly help alleviate some of the anxiety felt by us rural residents who depend on a well for water.
Thanks, Mark.
I can respond to the monetary portion of that comment. Just going back again to one of the examples I gave of City of Guelph, their policy does not specify any specific dollar figure. And, reading between the lines, my thought on why that would be is probably just what you described. Your situation is maybe very different than your neighbor's situation, depending on what their property and land use and water use looks like. So it's very difficult, I think, to anticipate what an appropriate number is in a policy. And so it may be better to determine that through the process as opposed to predetermining it in the document itself.
Thank you.
If I might respond, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark. No, that's good.
I'm going to counter that by saying if I run out of water or my neighbor runs out of water, it's the same thing. And the level of compensation needs to be equivalent. I don't think one can easily determine the level of anxiety involved easily. It's tough. It would be incredibly difficult to do. So I think determining a level of compensation ahead of time and an assured level of compensation is incredibly important.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
I'd go further than that, and I'd suggest it should be a minimum. And say a minimum of $25,000. And if you are a farmer with significant livestock, it should probably be more. And if you're someone who owns a trailer park, it should probably even be more.
Okay, thank you. We did have another question to the Q&A. So how many historical well interference complaints has the region received? There was a bar graph, but no total was given. Is that information available right away, like tonight, or?
So the total number of...
Yeah, I thought it was 17. Is that?
This was the historical. So historical
I'm
well
sorry.
interference complaints. I think it's in reference to the bar graph.
The only thing I know is the last one we received was in 2008, but we probably have to go back and look prior to that to see the numbers. I don't have that at offhand.
All right. And Samantha, your hand is up.
Thank you. So I had different questions, but I'm listening and responding. I think another big thing that we need to identify here is we have right now the region's looking at 17 well interference complaints. We're going to be looking at August 12th for staff to bring forward some options for council to vote on. In an ideal world, that evening, it can be figured out and we have an option in front of us that council can agree on, which is likely not going to happen. The region has 17 complaints to work through. What type of time frame, like what are residents, is emergency water going to be provided to residents through all this time? We're coming into what could be a very dry summer. If a resident has no water next week and they are waiting for a well interference committee to start at some point after August and they're 18th on the list, let's say they have some livestock, like what are we looking at here? Have you guys thought that part through yet?
Leslie.
So really, what are the interim measures before a new policy is in place?
I know there's the emergency water, and I greatly appreciate that. That was a huge relief for many residents. But is that like what's going to happen through the winter months? Like I know of a well interference complaint back in the 90s on Huron Road that took a year and a half through the well interference committee to be resolved. That was one. We're talking 17 at this point.
Leslie, are you on? Do you have
how many years is this going to take for these people to have?
So Amy, if you want to address the question.
I was just asking if Leslie is on and has the up-to-date stats on, how many are outstanding and where we're at with some of those. Obviously, Samantha, I can assure you that if someone was without water, there's no time frame with respect to us providing water until that's resolved. But I'll pass it over to Leslie.
Sure. So I think there's a couple pieces to this. If the new policy had a well interference complaint committee, we would strive to create a policy where the significant majority of cases are resolved in advance of going to the committee. And that is our hope with the new policy. So hopefully all 17 or whatever the case may be don't end up in the committee, and we can resolve them outside of the committee between the homeowner and the consulting team if that's the way that we go.
And how would you do that? What would be done differently than this process? Because what the residents that I'm aware of that have reported issues have, I don't think all of them have appealed, but I know quite a few have. So what would be done differently to resolve their issues?
So this is what we're trying to establish and what the new policy would look like and the processes that we would go through. If I wanted to speak to Guelph's policy, for example, then they do the technical evaluation with a consulting team and try to reach a solution directly between the consulting team, city staff, and the homeowner. And it's only if that decision can't be made between those parties that it goes to the appeal committee. And so hopefully we could establish something similar in this case.
And I think part of your question, Samantha, related to the emergency water supply, that people would not be going without water. And I think, Amy, you spoke to, regardless of the steps that the process is through and the need for investigation, you would be addressing that. Is that?
That's correct. Yeah.
So step one is emergency water. Step two would be sort of a different policy for residents that would involve maybe engaging a third party at an earlier time. And then that resident would, because I think part of the trouble that residents are having is that I think having that third party consultant involved earlier on would help them to communicate, because right now the residents have felt like have had to reiterate their concerns repeatedly to the region, and then the region then gives that message to the consultant, where I think having the resident be able to directly do that the first time would probably help.
That's great. That's really great feedback to have. Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you, Samantha. We do have a couple of questions. Some of them have already been answered, so I won't repeat those. So are there any new questions? You can raise your hand or type into the Q&A. We do have a couple of minutes left. While people are thinking, we could go to a poll. Kira, do you mind launching the second question? So the second one, and again, these questions are actually included in the poll that you see online, that you can access either through the QR code or through the link. So after the meeting, we would love, we've given you a couple of samples, but we would love to get your feedback on all of the questions. So this one is, in your view, what could improve fairness and transparency in the complaint and appeal process? So select up to 3 of the multiple choices. So a more independent appeal process is one, clear explanation of how the decisions are made, access to the information used in investigation, opportunity to provide input or respond to findings before a decision is made. And then the last 3, more consistent approach across all cases, improved communication throughout the process, or a larger range of response or compensation options. And we'll just give people a few minutes to think about those. Whenever you're ready, Kara. Okay. So it looks like we've had 10 respondents, 8 of which, so the majority would have chosen a more independent appeal process, so e.g. committee model. We've also got a large number suggesting access to the information used in investigation, both of which are themes for this evening's discussion. And then the next would be an opportunity to provide input or respond to findings before a decision is made. And then the next largest is clear explanations of how a decision is made. And then we've got a couple of folks interested in improved communications throughout the process and a more consistent approach across all cases and a larger range of response or compensation options. And I think that covered all of them. And so thank you for that. And again, I do encourage you to go into the survey and provide us with any comments that you have. All of the questions that relate to the review policy we have covered this evening. I do see Laverne, your hand is up. Would that be from before?
No, it's not.
Okay. So new question?
Yes.
Right.
On Whitmer Road, which you might know as the Shingletown Marsh, part of that property is on the new gravel pit, a small portion of it. That gravel pit was previously called cattle land, which had 5,000 head of cattle. And so there was a lot of nitrogen. And so the properties to the east of me, the one closest to the pit is almost a stone throw from the fence line. That well was pretty much unusable. And so when the new owner came in, he drilled a new well 15 feet behind that one. And I talked to the driller and he said there wasn't enough water to supply a house. So they mixed the two wells together and put equipment on it. Hello?
Oh, you're still here.
Okay.
I think we just lost the presentation.
There was a huge pile of manure, basically what you would call it, that was taken out of the pits. And that is still piled there to this day. So why is this not investigated? There was a study done prior to the gravel pit going in there, but it was very much covered up by hauling topsoil over the most polluted areas. So I just want this to be known because that nitrogen is spreading and my well is fine, but my two neighbors to the east of me are not as good, especially the one closest to the pit. So if you can make any comment on that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, and it might be, Amy, I'll pass it on to you, but it may be an opportunity just to follow up to that email address or directly with someone on the call to speak about that issue in particular, as opposed to this evening.
Yeah, I do know that this is under the purview of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And so they oversee the pits operations and conditions and licensing. So it would probably be more of a question for MNRF versus the region who doesn't oversee the operations of the pit. So
thank you. We've got 1 minute left. Mark, I'll give you a final comment or final question. And then I do want to thank everybody for their participation tonight.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'll just say this, and I'm trying to represent the general feeling and attitude of my neighbors and the residents of Wilmot Township. And that is that, in a sense, we are making a sacrifice here, jeopardizing our water supply so that someone else in the city can have a guaranteed supply. And that doesn't feel good to us. It feels as if we're doing something for which we're not compensated. And I think that's important to note. You will do everything possible as the region to ensure that no one in the city runs out of water ever. Yet we do here in the countryside. And I would hope that that could be conveyed to council, that it is emotionally taxing and probably unfair that we are making that sacrifice for others.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Comment is appreciated. And I am going to, doesn't look like we have any new questions. And I will say once again, thank you, everybody, for participating. There is the survey. Please go to that. And as Matt mentioned, there will be a council report coming up. And as Amy suggested, there is opportunity for further one-on-one conversations. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.